Sit down. The officer's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and angry. The chair screeched against the tiled floor as they shoved the teenage girl into it. Her hands trembled, her chest heaved, but her eyes refused to drop. The station smelled of old coffee, stale cigarettes, and the faint burn of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Another officer slammed a folder on the desk, leaning over her. "Think you're smart, huh? Out there causing trouble in the streets?" His tone dripped with irritation, like she wasn't a person but a problem. The girl didn't answer. Her silence seemed to provoke them even more. The room grew hotter, heavier, the air itself thick with unspoken accusations. Officers shuffled in the background, whispering, smirking, throwing sideways glances. It wasn't just an interrogation. It was a performance for everyone watching. "Search her again," barked the sergeant from across the room. One of the younger cops hesitated, but orders were orders. He stepped forward, rough hands tugging at her sleeves, patting her down with no patience, no care. The girl flinched, not from guilt, but from the sting of being treated like a suspect when she'd barely spoken a word. And then it happened. The officer yanked at her jacket. The fabric didn't just give way, it ripped, tearing down the seam with a violent sound that echoed through the room. Threads snapped. The girl gasped softly, her breath catching in her throat, as the jacket slid off her shoulder. Silence fell. Every eye in the station froze on the exposed skin of her arm. What they saw wasn't a bruise or a weapon or a mark of crime. It was a tattoo. But not just any tattoo. It was bold, intricate, deliberate. A design so charged with meaning that the chatter died instantly. The smirks vanished. The tension shifted from mockery to something heavier. Shock. The sergeant squinted, his voice faltering. For the first time that night. "Wait a second. What is that?" The younger officer stepped back, his face pale. Whispers began again, but now they weren't mocking. They were fearful, uncertain, as if the ink beneath her skin carried a secret bigger than anyone in the room had expected. The girl sat still, lips pressed tight, eyes unwavering. She didn't flinch anymore. If anything, she looked taller, stronger, her silence no longer weakness, but defiance. The tattoo wasn't just art, it was a statement, and everyone in that room knew it. The sergeant swallowed hard, his authority cracking at the edges. Do you know what that means?" he muttered. But the question wasn't really for her. It was for himself, for the officers shifting uneasily behind him. The ripped jacket lay in tatters on the floor. The girl's truth was out, revealed not by words, but by the mark she carried on her skin. A mark that tied her to a story none of them had prepared to face. The silence in that station was deafening. And in that silence, something changed. The officers weren't just looking at a teenager anymore. They were staring at a living reminder of a legacy, a wound, a truth that demanded to be seen. The girl inhaled slowly, her eyes cutting through the room like glass. The tattoo was her shield now, her unspoken weapon, and for the first time that night, it wasn't her who looked afraid. No one knew what would come next. But deep down, every officer in that room could feel it. This was no ordinary arrest. This was the beginning of something far bigger than any of them had imagined. And that was only the beginning of her story. Because to understand why that tattoo left the whole station in shock, we need to step back. We need to know who she really is and what that mark means. Before the silence in that police station, before the ripping of her jacket, before the world saw what she carried on her skin, there was just a girl, a teenager trying to survive in a place that seemed determined to break her. Her name was Amara, 16 years old, bright eyes that carried more fire than fear. But in the neighborhood where she grew up, brightness wasn't always safe. The cracked sidewalks, graffiti-tagged walls, and flickering streetlights told a story of survival. The sirens at night weren't unusual. They were background noise, as normal as crickets in other places. Amara lived with her mother in a small two-bedroom apartment. The walls were thin, the rent was late more often than not, and the fridge hummed louder than it was ever full. Her father had been gone since she was 7, taken not by choice, but by a bullet in a robbery gone wrong. That absence left more than an empty chair at the dinner table. It left a shadow. Her mother worked double shifts, sometimes triple, cleaning offices by night and diners by day. She'd often come home too tired to even eat, collapsing on the couch still in uniform. Amara would gently take off her shoes, cover her with a blanket, and whisper promises to herself. "One day, Mum. One day, I'll make it better." At school, Amara was different. She wasn't the loudest, but she was sharp. Teachers noticed her curiosity, her hunger for knowledge. But classmates saw something else. Her refusal to bow to pressure, her unwillingness to let herself be small. That made her a target. One afternoon, in the cracked basketball court behind the school, a group of older kids cornered her. They mocked her clothes, her shoes, the way she carried herself. One girl sneered, "You think you're better than us, huh?" Amara stared back, her voice calm but steady. "I don't think I'm better. I just think I can be more." That sentence followed her. Some hated her for it. Some respected her. But she didn't care. She was already building her armor, the invisible kind, the kind stitched from resilience. Still, every warrior carries scars, and Amara's heart carried plenty. Nights of crying quietly so her MO they wouldn't hear. Days of pretending not to notice the whispers about her father. Moments of wondering if life would ever get easier. It was during one of those nights, sitting on her bed with the window cracked open to the sound of sirens, that she thought about the tattoo. Her father had always spoken of legacy. "We don't just live for ourselves," he once told her. "We carry the stories of those who came before us, and we pass them forward." That idea stuck like glue. Her uncle, a veteran, had a symbol inked across his forearm, a mark of unity and sacrifice, something he'd carried from his time in service. She remembered tracing the lines as a child, listening to him explain what each curve, each word meant. To him, it wasn't just ink. It was identity. So when Amara turned 16, she walked into a small tattoo parlor on the edge of town. The buzzing needle filled the air, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose. She clenched her fist, not from fear, but from determination. The artist looked at her, raising a brow. "You sure about this? You're young. This stays with you forever." Amara nodded once. "That's the point." The design was bold, striking, etched into her skin with care. It wasn't just about beauty. It was about memory. About her father's words. About her uncle's legacy. About a lineage of struggle and strength that the world too often ignored. When she walked out that night, the bandage covering her arm felt heavier than it should have. Not because of pain, but because of meaning. Her mother was furious when she found out. "A tattoo, Amara? At your age? You think this makes life easier?" But when her mother finally saw the design, when she recognized what it symbolized, her anger melted into tears. She hugged her daughter, whispering, "Your father would have been proud." That tattoo became Amara's secret armor. Every time someone mocked her duty, baited her, tried to tear her down, she remembered what was carved beneath her sleeve. She wasn't just one girl in a broken neighborhood. She was the sum of generations. She was the voice of people silenced. She was living proof that pain could turn into power. And yet, she never expected that one day, That ink would become the center of everything. That it would silence an entire police station. That it would force people who looked at her as nothing to suddenly see her as something. Because that tattoo wasn't just a reminder of where she came from. It was a prophecy of where she was going. And the night her jacket was ripped apart, that prophecy was forced into the light. It began with the sound of shouting. Amara had just left the corner store, clutching a paper bag with bread and a carton of milk. The evening sky was painted orange and violet, the streets buzzing with restless energy. Kids played tag along the sidewalks while older teens lingered near the basketball courts. But up ahead, voices clashed, sharp and angry, cutting through the usual rhythm of the block. Two boys squared off in the middle of the street. One pushed the other hard enough to draw gasps from the small crowd forming around them. Amara froze. She wasn't looking for trouble, but in her neighborhood, trouble didn't need permission. It found you. She recognized the faces, Marcus and Deshawn, both known for short tempers, both known for dragging others into their fights. She sighed, clutching the bag tighter, whispering to herself, "Not tonight. Just keep walking." But then the shoving turned to fists. The crowd grew louder, circling, chanting, egging them on. It wasn't just a fight. It was fuel waiting for a spark. Amara's heart pounded. She'd seen too many fights like this end badly. Someone would pull a knife, someone would end up on the ground bleeding, and the next day, another name would be added to the whispers of the block. She stepped closer, her voice cutting through the noise. "Hey, enough! Stop it before it gets worse!" For a split second, the boys paused. Marcus sneered at her. "Stay out of this, Amara. Don't play hero." But by then it was too late. Sirens wailed in the distance. Blue and red lights painted the brick walls, flashing against the faces of the crowd. The fight broke apart, but the chaos didn't end. It only shifted. Kids scattered, sprinting down alleys, vanishing behind fences. The block erupted in panic. Amara stood frozen, caught in the swirl of bodies running past her. And then, just as quickly as the crowd dispersed, the police stormed in. Tires screeched, doors slammed, and officers spilled out, barking orders. "Hands up, on the ground, now!" Their flashlights cut through the dusk, sweeping across faces, looking for someone, anyone, to pin down. And then their eyes landed on her. Amara. She was standing too close to the fight. She was holding a bag. She was black. To them, that was enough. One officer rushed forward, grabbing her by the arm. "You, against the wall!" She stammered. "Wait, I didn't—" But her words drowned beneath the officer's shout. "Don't move!" The bag slipped from her hand, spilling milk across the pavement, bread rolling into the gutter. She tried to explain, tried to pull away just enough to show she wasn't resisting, but every small movement was met with more force. Another officer shoved her shoulder. "Thought you could run, huh? Thought we wouldn't catch you?" Confusion blurred her mind. She hadn't been fighting. She hadn't been running. She was just there. The neighbors peeked from their porches, some shaking their heads, others too afraid to speak. No one wanted to get involved. Amara's voice cracked as she tried again. "I didn't do anything. Please." But they weren't listening. They never listened. They pushed her toward the squad car, their grip bruising, their tone sharp. It wasn't an arrest built on facts. It was built on assumptions, on the pounds, the picture they had already painted of her before they even asked her name. One officer muttered under his breath, "Another troublemaker. Same story, different night." His words cut deeper than the roughness of his hands. She wasn't a person to them. She was just another story, another box to check off, another problem to drag into the system. Her chest tightened, anger mixing with fear. She thought of her mother, waiting at home, exhausted from her shift. She thought of her father, the way his life had been stolen in the same streets. She thought of her tattoo, hidden beneath her jacket, burning like fire against her skin. And she realized this moment wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about perception. To them, she looked like the part they wanted to fill, and no explanation could erase that. The squad car door slammed shut behind her. The world outside blurred through the glass as the engine roared to life. She was trapped, not by steel, but by the weight of prejudice pressing down on her shoulders. The fight in the street was already over, but a bigger fight had just begun. And it was a fight Amara never asked for. Because once she was dragged into that station, the truth written on her skin would change everything. The squad car door slammed open, and rough hands pulled Amara into the cold, grey belly of the police station. The place smelled of sweat, old coffee, and paper. Rows of desks cluttered with files, phones ringing, voices echoing off the cinder block walls. But all that faded under the weight of the stairs. Every step she took was watched. Some officers sneered, others shook their heads as if they already knew her story. To them, she was guilty before she'd even spoken. They sat her down hard on a metal chair in the center of a small, dimly lit room. The light above buzzed, flickering, casting shadows that stretched across the walls like bars. "Name?" one officer barked. "Amara," she whispered. "Speak up," another snapped. "Don't play games in here." She repeated her name louder, her voice steady this time, but steadiness didn't matter. To them, her tone was already an attitude, her silence already a confession. The questions began. "Were you part of the fight? Who threw the first punch? What gang are you with?" Each one fired like a bullet, assumptions loaded into every word. Amara shook her head. "I wasn't fighting. I was just what? Hanging around looking for trouble?" The officer cut her off, his smirk spreading like oil. The others chuckled. It wasn't an interrogation. It was humiliation. Minutes stretched into hours. They searched her bag, spilling its contents across the table. A crushed loaf of bread, a dented carton of milk. Nothing more. But instead of apologizing, they grew frustrated. They wanted something to prove their suspicion right. And when they couldn't find it, anger replaced patience. One officer pacing the room slammed his hand against the wall. "I'm done wasting time. Check her again." Amara's breath caught. She had already been searched. She had already been treated like less than human. But now, they were determined to break her. A younger cop stepped forward, hesitant but obedient. He tugged at her sleeve, patted her sides. Still nothing. He glanced at his superior, uncertainty in his eyes. "Harder!" the sergeant snapped. "She's hiding something. I can feel it." The officer grabbed at her jacket. Amara tried to pull back, her voice trembling but defiant. "Stop! That's mine. Rip." The sound sliced through the room like thunder. Fabric tore, threads snapped, and her jacket fell open. The officers froze. On her arm, revealed under the harsh fluorescent light, was the tattoo. Bold, striking, etched deep into her skin with lines that told a story none of them had expected. The laughter died instantly. The sneers vanished. The room, once filled with mockery, turned silent. One officer leaned closer, his eyes narrowed. Wait, is that—" The sergeant's face drained of colour. His jaw tightened, his breath stuttered. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath. The younger cop stepped back as if the tattoo itself had burned him. Amara sat still, her chest rising and falling, her eyes locked on theirs. She didn't need to explain. The ink spoke louder than words ever could. It wasn't a random design. It wasn't rebellion. It was history, legacy, a mark tied to a name, a story, a movement far bigger than one girl in a chair. The officers knew it, And in that moment, their authority cracked. The sergeant swallowed hard, his voice faltering for the first time. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Amara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was enough. Because what they saw wasn't just a tattoo, it was a mirror, a reminder of truths they had tried to ignore. And suddenly, the girl they thought was powerless held all the power in the room. The ripped jacket lay in shreds at her feet. The officers shifted uncomfortably, wrestling with the weight of what they had just uncovered. The clash was no longer between Amara and authority. It was between authority and truth. And the truth had already won. But to understand why this single tattoo could shake an entire room of officers, we have to go deeper, into the story behind the ink and the legacy that gave it power. The room was frozen. Every officer's gaze locked on the ink across Amara's arm. The once loud station seemed to hold its breath. Even the buzzing light above felt quieter, as though the world itself knew something heavy had just been revealed. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a name, etched in sweeping, careful strokes. A name every officer in that room recognized, and above it a symbol, a clenched fist, breaking through chains, wrapped in the words, "No justice, no peace." The sergeant's lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes darted between the ink and Amara's face, as if confirming the impossible. Finally, his voice cracked into the silence. That's Elijah Brooks." A murmur rippled through the room. Elijah Brooks, the community activist, the man who had marched on these very streets, who had led rallies against police brutality years before. The man whose fiery speeches drew both admiration and fear. The man who had died, suspiciously, during a routine traffic stop. Every officer there knew his name. Some had even been on duty the night of his death. They remembered the protests, the headlines, the way the city seemed ready to burst. And now, his name was burned into the arm of a teenage girl sitting before them. Amara lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, steady, but sharp as glass. "He was my uncle." The words dropped like stones into water. No one moved. No one blinked. The younger cop, the one who had ripped her jacket, stumbled back, his face pale. He muttered under his breath, "Oh my God." The sergeant's fists clenched at his sides. He tried to regain control, tried to steady his voice. Why would you carry that name? You don't understand what he did. He stirred chaos. He put lives at risk." Amara's eyes burned with fire. "He fought for hours. He stood for people you wouldn't listen to. He gave his life for truth." The room cracked under the weight of those words. Officers shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze, others staring at the floor. They remembered the marches, the chants outside the station, the anger in the community, and deep down, they remembered the guilt, the unanswered questions about how Elijah Brooks really died. The tattoo wasn't rebellion, it was defiance. A living reminder that the fight hadn't ended with Elijah's death. It had continued, carried forward by the next generation. One officer whispered to another, his voice trembling, "She's his blood. She's his niece." The realization spread like wildfire. Suddenly the mocking teenager they thought they had, power over became untouchable, because her story was bigger than hers alone. Amara could feel the shift. For the first time, the silence wasn't directed at her as an accusation. It was fear. It was respect. It was the cracking of their illusion of control. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind, words she'd heard at a rally when she was only 10. They can take a life, but they can't erase a name. They can silence a voice, but they can't kill the truth. And here she was, years later, proving him right. His name lived on in her skin, in her spirit. The sergeant leaned back, his face a mask of conflict. He wanted to reassert his authority, to remind her she was still just a teenager in custody. But every time his eyes landed on the tattoo, his voice faltered. Amara's silence now was more powerful than any protest. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to explain. The ink told her story, and it reminded every officer in that room of the history they carried on their hands. Finally, the sergeant muttered, almost to himself, "You shouldn't be here. Not you." But she was, and she wasn't leaving quietly. Because the moment her jacket was ripped, everything changed. This wasn't just about a street fight. It wasn't about assumptions. It was about legacy, justice, and a truth too heavy for them to bury. The tattoo had spoken, and the whole station was listening. But the story of the tattoo didn't end in that room. To understand why it carried such weight, why it left hardened officers shaken, we need to unravel the history behind it, the story of Elijah Brooks, and the legacy that shaped Amara's world. The ink on Amara's arm wasn't just a mark. It was a story, one that began long before she was born. In the dimly lit station, the officers stared at the tattoo, but in Amara's mind, another world opened. Memories, voices, the echoes of a man who had shaped her family's destiny. Elijah Brooks. Her uncle wasn't a celebrity in the traditional sense. He wasn't on TV for glamour, nor did he seek fame. But in her neighborhood, in her community, his name, it carried the weight of thunder. He was the man who stood when others bowed, who spoke when silence felt safer. Amara remembered being 8 years old, perched on her mother's shoulders at a rally. She could barely see past the sea of people, but she could hear him. Elijah's voice boomed through a megaphone, rising above chants, above car horns, above the noise of a city that tried not to listen. They tell us to stay quiet. They tell us to wait. But justice doesn't wait. Justice demands to be heard now. The crowd roared back, fists raised, voices breaking into a single unstoppable wave. For little Amara, that was the moment she realized her uncle wasn't just a man. He was a force. At family gatherings, Elijah wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was the most commanding. He carried himself with dignity, like he was carved from the same stone as the leaders in history books. He told stories of their ancestors, of slavery and freedom, of marches and movements. His words always circled back to one lesson. We don't just live for ourselves, we carry the fire of those who lit the path before us. But Elijah also carried scars. The police stopped him often, sometimes for no reason at all. Tickets for taillights that weren't broken, pat-downs for matching a description, arrests that never stuck. Every time he stood tall, never breaking, but each encounter etched another line into his story. And then came the night that silenced him forever. Amara was too young to fully understand, but she remembered the whispers. Elijah had been pulled over. A routine traffic stop, they called it. But it ended with his lifeless body sprawled across the asphalt. The official report spoke of resisting arrest. The community spoke of murder. The city burned with anger. Protests filled the streets. News cameras swarmed. Politicians made statements, but no officer was charged. Elijah became both a martyr and a wound that never healed. Amara's mother cried for weeks. But she also kept Elijah's words alive, telling Amara bedtime stories not of fairy tales, but of bravery and truth. She would point to old photographs, Elijah at a podium, Elijah marching, Elijah holding Amara as a baby, and whisper, "Never forget who you come from." Years later, when Amara turned 16, she knew what she had to do. The tattoo wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. She chose the clenched fist to mirror the posters her uncle once carried. She chose the words, "No justice, no peace," because they had been his chant, his cry, his final echo through the streets. And she chose his name, Elijah Brooks, because no matter what the world tried to erase, she would keep him alive in her skin. Now, sitting in that station under the gaze of the very institution that had silenced him, she felt his presence like armor around her. The officers felt it too. One muttered, barely audible, "That case, it almost ruined this department." Another whispered back, "And now she's sitting right here." The sergeant's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed him. He remembered the protests. He remembered the firebombed police cars, the chants outside the station doors, the way the department had scrambled to protect its own reputation while the community bled with grief. And here was Elijah's niece, silent but unbreakable, carrying his name in black ink. The balance of power shifted. What began as an interrogation turned into a reckoning. Every assumption they had thrown at her, criminal, troublemaker, suspect, crumbled under the weight of her legacy. Amara's silence was louder than any speech. She sat tall, her gaze steady, daring them to deny what they saw. The sergeant finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "You don't understand what you're carrying." Her reply was calm, almost gentle, but unshakable. "I understand enough. He carried it. Now I do." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Some felt shame, others defensiveness. But none could escape the truth etched into her arm. They weren't facing just a teenager. They were facing history. And history has a way of exposing lies. In that moment, Amara realized something powerful. Her uncle's fight hadn't died with him. It lived in her. Every time someone underestimated her, every time someone tried to silence her, she carried a reminder that silence had never won. The ripped jacket at her feet wasn't humiliation anymore. It was revelation. The tattoo wasn't a secret to hide. It was a truth to unveil. And now that it had been seen, there was no turning back. But while the station wrestled with its silence, the world outside was about to take notice. Because stories like these don't stay hidden, and Amara's story was only beginning to spread. The room had changed. Moments before, it was filled with laughter, smirks, and careless authority. Now, it was hollow. The officers who had mocked Amara sat frozen in their own silence, like statues carved from disbelief. The fluorescent light hummed above them, but no one dared speak first. Her tattoo, her uncle's name, still burned in their minds. One officer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, but the sound only echoed the tension. Another avoided her eyes completely, staring at the floor like a child caught in a lie. They all felt it. The shame of realizing that their assumptions had collapsed in the face of truth. The sergeant leaned against the desk, his shoulders heavier than before. His voice, once sharp with authority, now cracked with doubt. "You don't know what you're carrying. Or maybe you do." Amara didn't answer. She sat tall in the chair, her torn jacket draped at her side, her tattoo glowing under the harsh light like a brand of defiance. Silence became her weapon. Every second she said nothing, the weight on them grew heavy. And one of the younger officers whispered to the man beside him, though the whole room could hear. "She's his niece. Elijah Brooks' niece. No wonder." The older cop beside him snapped, "Quiet." But even his voice lacked its usual edge. It trembled, betraying his unease. The silence stretched on. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of guilt. Thick, suffocating, impossible to escape. Amara's eyes scanned the room. She didn't see authority anymore. She saw fragility. Men and women in uniform who suddenly realized They had torn open something far larger than a jacket. For a brief moment, she almost felt exposed, vulnerable. The tattoo wasn't meant to be seen this way, under force, in humiliation. It was supposed to be her private reminder of her uncle's strength. Now it was public, laid bare under the judgmental eyes of those who least deserved to witness it. Her chest rose and fell. She wanted to shout, to demand answers for Elijah's death, to throw their own silence back at them. But she didn't, because she knew the power of silence too, and tonight, it wasn't her silence that felt weak. It was theirs. The sergeant finally broke, rubbing his temple, muttering almost to himself. "We didn't know. We didn't know who she was." A bitter laugh rose in Amara's throat, but she swallowed it down. Her voice came low, steady. "You didn't care who I was?" The words cut sharper than any scream. The room shifted again. Several officers flinched, as if struck. Others dropped their gaze entirely, unable to face her. And for the first time since she walked into that building, a trace of respect crept into their eyes. Not admiration, not friendship, but respect, the kind grudgingly given when you realize you've underestimated someone beyond repair. Still, the damage lingered. Their hands had left marks on her arms. Their words had stripped her dignity. Their assumptions had shoved her into the role of a criminal, and no amount of silence could erase that. She sat there, torn between vindication and vulnerability. Vindication, because they finally saw her not as a stereotype, but as a person tied to a legacy they couldn't dismiss. Vulnerability, because it had taken humiliation to get here. The sergeant straightened, his voice firmer now, though laced with unease. "Take her to holding. Carefully." The word carefully hung in the air. It was an order, but also an admission. They could no longer treat her as disposable. Not after what they had seen. Two officers moved toward her slowly, their steps hesitant, almost respectful now. They didn't grab her arms this time. They gestured instead, as though she had become someone different in their eyes. Amara stood, the silence following her like a shadow. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The weight of her presence remained in that room long after she stepped out. Behind her, the station stayed quiet. Guilt and disbelief sat heavy in the air. They had tried to strip her of dignity, and instead they had stripped themselves of authority. But Amara knew this moment was only the beginning. The silence inside the station would soon ripple outward, because secrets don't stay buried forever. And outside those walls, voices were already beginning to rise, ready to turn her story into something much larger than she could imagine. It started with whispers. A clerk in the station told her cousin. An officer muttered to a friend at a bar. By morning, the story had begun to slip through the cracks of silence, like water seeping under a locked door. "They ripped her jacket," one voice said. "They saw the tattoo," another whispered. "Do you know whose name it carried?" By noon, the neighborhood buzzed. Phones lit up. Screenshots of text messages spread across group chats. Old wounds reopened as people realized the girl sitting in that station was none other than Elijah Brooks' niece. The story couldn't be contained. It didn't belong to the police station anymore. It belonged to the people. On social media, hashtags exploded. #Justice for Amara. Elijah lives. Pictures of Elijah Brooks re-emerged, smiling, speaking, marching, side by side with grainy images of Amara from school, her face determined and young. The internet did what it always does. It gave life to a story the system wanted to bury. At a corner cafe, two older men who once marched with Elijah shook their heads, disbelief heavy in their voices. "They put hands on his blood? His own niece?" One of them clenched his fist. "He told us the fight wasn't over. Maybe this is what he meant." In a small classroom, A teacher paused mid-lesson as her students showed her their phones. She set the book down and whispered, "She was in my class last year. Quiet, but sharp. None of this surprises me." Even at Amara's apartment complex, neighbors gathered in the courtyard. Her mother's face was drawn, worried yet fierce, as she explained to them, "They tried to break her, but they only proved Elijah was right all along." The story spread faster than the officers inside the station could contain it. Reporters showed up at the precinct, microphones out, cameras rolling, demanding answers. "Is it true you detained Elijah Brooks's niece? Why was she treated with such force? Was she targeted because of who she is?" The police spokesperson fumbled, dodging questions, offering vague statements about ongoing investigations. But the people outside weren't fooled. They'd heard this language before. They knew the rhythm of excuses, and so the crowd grew. By the next day, protesters filled the steps of the station. Voices rose in chants that shook the walls. "No justice, no peace." The same words etched into Amara's skin now echoed through the streets, louder than ever. Signs rose into the air. Posters of Elijah Brooks appeared again, carried by a new generation that refused to let his story fade. But now, Bestie Chisant, hid his face. They carried Amara's name too. Inside the holding cell, Amara could hear them. The voices, the chants, the energy of a city that suddenly knew her name. She sat on the hard bench, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from awe. She had always felt small, fighting quietly in her own way. But now, the world was fighting with her. One officer, pacing outside her cell, muttered under his breath, "It's happening all over again." The sergeant silenced him with a glare, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. Because he knew. Once the voices started, they didn't stop. Once the people remembered Elijah, they wouldn't forget Amara. For the first time, Amara felt the true weight of the tattoo. It wasn't just her shield anymore. It had become a beacon, a rallying point, a story bigger than one girl in handcuffs. Her uncle's legacy had found new breath, and she was the vessel carrying it forward. The station was no longer just a building of authority. It had become a stage, and the world was watching. The officers shifted nervously, the chants outside growing louder, stronger, undeniable. The silence that had once filled the station was replaced by a chorus they couldn't control. And as Amara sat in that cell, she whispered to herself, "Uncle Elijah, they hear us again." But she also knew voices could be powerful, yet fragile. If her story was to matter, if this movement was to grow, it couldn't stop here. Because the next step wasn't just protest, it was confrontation, and the system would not give in without a fight. The chants outside the station didn't fade with the night. They grew louder, fiercer, until the entire city seemed to vibrate with them. By morning, news crews circled like hawks, their cameras aimed at the precinct doors. Headlines screamed across televisions and phones. "Police detain Elijah Brooks's niece." Tattoo sparks firestorm. Over justice. Inside the department, chaos brewed. A closed-door meeting filled the chief's office with tension thick enough to choke on. Officers sat around a long table, files open but ignored, coffee untouched. The chief's jaw was tight, his voice sharp. "We're under fire. The public wants answers." What happened in that room? No one volunteered the truth. They shuffled papers, exchanged glances, hoping someone else would take the blame. Finally, the sergeant spoke, his tone clipped. "We followed procedure. She resisted. The jacket tore." A younger officer, pale from guilt, muttered, "That's not how it went." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him. His hands trembled as he spoke again, louder this time. She didn't resist. We pushed too hard, and then we saw the tattoo. The chief's stare cut through him like a blade, but the damage was already done. The lie had cracked. The truth was spilling out. Meanwhile, outside the precinct walls, the protests transformed into organized rallies. Community leaders, pastors, students, and elders took the microphone, demanding accountability. Posters of Amara's tattoo flooded the streets, painted on walls, printed on T-shirts. The clenched fist breaking chains became a new emblem of resistance. And then, for the first time since her arrest, Amara spoke. In a small community center packed with cameras and neighbors, she stood at a podium, her hands gripping the wood to steady herself. At first her voice was quiet, uncertain. They tried to strip me of dignity. They tried to treat me like I was nothing. She paused, lifting her sleeve to reveal the tattoo. The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling like waves. Her voice grew stronger. But this name, this legacy, it reminds me I am not nothing. I am someone. I am Elijah Brooks' niece, and I will not be silent. The room erupted in cheers, applause shaking the walls. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, but more importantly, people listened. Amara's words lit a fire that spread far beyond her. City. News outlets across the nation picked up her speech. Commentators debated it on television. Some painted her as a symbol of courage. Others, predictably, dismissed her as a troublemaker. Back inside the department, the pressure mounted. Officers whispered about resignations. The mayor demanded an internal review. And for the first time, the department couldn't simply brush the story aside. Too many eyes were watching. But Amara didn't care about their politics. She cared about her uncle's legacy, about the voices that had been silenced too long. Each time she spoke, her confidence grew. Each time she lifted her sleeve, the world remembered Elijah. And now, her. The confrontation was no longer between one girl and a few officers. It was between truth and a system that had tried again and again to bury it. And this time the system was losing. But even as the city roared with calls for change, Amara knew the journey wasn't over. Because symbols can inspire, but real change comes when silence is shattered and power is forced to listen. It began with a torn jacket, but now it was a movement. The tattoo that once hid beneath Amara's sleeve had broken free, not just in the police station, but across the city, across the country. Murals of the clenched fist and Elijah Brooks's name appeared on brick walls overnight. Students painted it on posters. Marchers wore it across their chests. What was once private ink became a public rallying cry. And at the center of it all stood Amara. No longer just a teenager caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, she had become something bigger, a voice her community refused to ignore. In a crowded town hall, she stood before a sea of faces, elders with tear-streaked cheeks, children hoisted on their parents' shoulders, reporters scribbling notes as cameras rolled. She gripped the microphone, her voice steady, her eyes burning with conviction. They tried to make me small. They tried to make me silent. But my uncle taught me something long before they dragged me into that station. He taught me that truth doesn't bow, and neither do I. The crowd erupted, a thunder of claps and cheers shaking the walls. She lifted her sleeve again, showing the tattoo. But this time it wasn't ripped from her. This time it was her choice, her declaration. This is not just for me. This is for every voice ignored, for every name buried, for every truth denied. They can try to silence us, but we will not disappear. Her words traveled far beyond the room. News stations aired them. Social media turned them into clips, replayed millions of times. She became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of courage. Meanwhile, the department itself faced the mirror it had long avoided. Internal reviews, public hearings, officers called to testify. For once, silence could no longer protect them. Some tried to dismiss her as just a girl, too young to matter. But the more they tried, the louder her story grew. Because people weren't just listening to Amara, they were listening to the echo of Elijah Brooks through her. They were listening to history refuse to stay buried. In her room at night, Amara would sit by the window, the city lights glowing outside. She'd trace the lines of her tattoo, remembering the pain of the needle, the weight of her mother's tears, the strength of her uncle's voice. And she whispered to herself, "You're still here, Uncle. You're still fighting. Through me." The girl who once walked home carrying bread and milk now carried something far heavier. But she carried it with pride. The jacket was gone, the fabric torn and forgotten. But what it revealed had stitched something new, an unbreakable bond between past and present, between memory and change. The story closed not with silence, but with sound. The sound of voices rising together, the sound of prejudice cracking beneath trowel. The sound of a community finally believing again in its own strength. And Amara, once treated as nothing, stood as proof of something powerful. That strength, legacy, and identity can shatter prejudice. That truth, even when forced into the light, cannot be dimmed. And that sometimes the smallest spark, the rip of a jacket, the reveal of a tattoo, can ignite a fire that changes everything.